Hey Cheshire, of all these books in this library, what would you say is the most difficult? Are you kidding? All of them. Oh, come on, Cheshire, what kind of attitude is that? Hey, wait a second. Let's turn that frown upside down with some of my best tips for dealing with boring, tedious, frustrating books that you don't want to read, but you have to read, and you have to remember them too. I went to university for a very, very long time, and year after year, I was confronted with boring, tedious, frustrating books that I had to read, and I had to remember what was in them. So I developed a lot of strategies for how to deal with it and, feel the pain and get through it anyway. And not only that, but remember the material and be able to translate that material into my own words to pass exams. Now, this hasn't changed any after university. I still have to do that in my own work. Part of me really loves The Art of Memory by Frances Yates, but I found it really tedious and dry and boring to get through. And so I used a particular strategy I'll share with you today. And there are other books by her that I've read, and they were also dry, tedious, boring, and I found a way to get through them because I love the knowledge inside, but not necessarily the way they were written. So the first strategy I have for you is one of the most important. And the strategy has a name, which is patience. Now, you might be thinking, oh my goodness, what kind of technique or strategy is that? I want the whiz-bang memory palace stuff. We'll get to that. But patience is so important. Why? Because each and every author has their own style, and each author may have multiple styles that they show up with across their career. And so sometimes they might have a book that's super exciting. Other times, they might have a book that's filled with symbols, and you then have to go and learn those symbols in order to engage. For example, I read some stuff from Graham Priest that wasn't symbol heavy, and then I come to one and it's like, what? There's all kinds of symbols I had to learn. And so I had to enact patience. Be willing to step back and learn the symbols first before charging into the book and then reading it and understanding it. And here's where ye old memory palace technique comes into play. See, this is the symbol for totality, which I never knew before. And at first I was kind of like, how the heck am I going to memorize that? But then I thought, totality kind of sounds a little bit like totem pole. And so in a memory palace, I placed a totem pole with this sort of horseshoe-shaped symbol. I have no understanding of math and had never really gotten into logic of this kind before that Graham Priest is talking about, but bang presto, put it on a card, draw it, make it real and tangible for myself, have it in a memory palace at the same time, and I learned it very, very quickly, and then I just went on to the next symbol, and the next symbol, and the next symbol, and so on, and just made it real to my mind, so that then I could go into the book and read it and understand it. And this is coming from not only the tactic of the memory palace technique, but the patience to recognize the limitation and then prepare so that it is no longer a limitation so you can go forward. Strategy number 2 gets into what I just mentioned, using a memory palace. If you don't know what a memory palace is, it's a way of creating a building like the one I'm sitting in, but in your mind, and then assigning information to space. So that totem pole is in the corner, and it's just there in an imaginary way, and it's with this sort of horseshoe-looking symbol, and they're interacting with each other. And then when I think back to that location, I'm able to work out what that was. Oh, right, that's the symbol for totality, and away we go. And one thing that you can do if you need help creating a memory palace is to get my free course at magneticmerrymethod.com/YT. YT stands for YouTube, and it will help you develop not just one memory palace, but an entire network of them.
And I think for a person who does not take magnetic memory method, they are deep knowing that it's available. They are depriving themselves of oxygen. I don't mean they're suffocating, but there could have been way more vitality in what they're doing in their lives.
And of course, you can get subscribed to this channel if you're new here, and one way or the other, hit that thumbs up for the love of memory. Now, in terms of the memory palace technique and working with books that are boring and tedious, one of the reasons why you really, really want to make sure that you master this technique is because it's really hard to be bored when you're using it. You're looking at phrases, words that you don't know, and you're able to rapidly absorb them into your memory because you're engaging with them in a creative way. You're not like, oh, well, totality, how am I going to figure this out? No, you're like, I'm going to take on this challenge and I'm going to make it something that is bigger and larger and more vibrant and exciting than it is unto itself. And that is deeply engaging. And so just at a page by page level, you find yourself slipping and you say, hang on a second, I'm slipping here, I'm bored, this is tedious. You look at the word the and you think, what image could I use in what memory palace? And then you go, oh, Thor is smashing his hammer down upon this page. I smite thee, O page of boredom. And now you're back into it, you're engaged. Let's try it together, shan't we? Against Parmenides and the other Eleatics, this is a pretty good argument. So against, we can just look at that and I'm thinking against the grain from Bad Religion. You know, I maintain against the grain, some song like that. That's a very nice image and I can think of the different band members and so forth. And then Parmenides, that word, I can think of Parmesan cheese, right? And then the Eleatics, what am I going to do for there? Well, L from Stranger Things, of course. And you just go on and practice with the next sentence. There's no reason to be bored unless you choose to be. If the topic is boring, then you could actually take it to the topic level and think, what is this book about? Non-duality. Boring, right? Well, it's not to me, but let's say that it was boring to me. I can then think, okay, so now how am I going to make the topic itself interesting? And then non-duality. Oh, nuns. Maybe Rowan Atkinson dressed as a nun. Woohoo! Already, it's much more interesting and engaging as a kind of mental model that you can use to go through even the most tough and challenging categories of information without ever finding it tedious or boring. Now let's talk about understanding. What do you do when you get stuck? I don't get it. I don't understand it. Not just at the level of, oh, they're using strange mathematical operators that you don't understand, but what if there's a sentence or a concept that you just don't get, huh? Well, one thing you can do just to make it more interesting immediately is try to find someone who's more engaging talking about it in the form of a video on YouTube or a podcast episode where they're enlivening it through their own excitement. You might not share that excitement, but this is where patience comes in again. If you're patient with just listening to a couple of episodes or watching a couple of videos about it, you might find that their enthusiasm rubs off a little bit. And if you have memory palaces already, memorize some of those points that they share about their excitement about it. So if I say, okay, I'm really into non-duality, here's what excites me about it. First of all, it is an idea that suggests that not only is the entire world comprised of just one thing with no other, no transcendent being on the other side, but it just is a great alternative. I love that it's an alternative to transcendence, which is the idea that there's some other thing that, you know, we don't necessarily have access to. Here it's saying, no, we have access to all of it because all things are coming into being at the same time. I mean, it's exciting as an alternative to the standard thought processes that have dominated the world for thousands and thousands of years. That excites me, that alternative. And then you could think about it. Okay, so he's saying that there's actually two stories here, and he's excited by the fact that there's two stories. You know, ooh, that is kind of interesting. You know, and then you get more engaged in it on that level, just simply modeling that. And I used to do that when I was in university. There were certain topics at university that I couldn't get into, but I would perceive the excitement that the professor had, and I would try to think through it. What is it that's so exciting for them? You know, I had a couple of research jobs where I was a research assistant for professors and so forth, and I had to read their books, and I wasn't into it at all. But I remember asking the professor, had to read his book, and I had to do all the citations in the book and so forth, and I said, what excites you about this? And he explained to me, and he just went through all of this amazing stuff that I hadn't ever thought about. And then I actually found that he was talking about those things in the book, but due to the nature of how books for big academic presses were written, it was in this sort of very calm and not badly written at all, but just academic, you know, scholarly. And so I was able, just by listening to him speak, to be able to perceive some of that great excitement and then bring it into my own life. Now, you all and we all have an advantage because back when I did that, YouTube wasn't even a thing, and I was able to ask him individually. But these days, I can go and I'll bet you I find 15 topics where it's exactly the topic of his book, and there are people foaming at the mouth in video and audio with tremendous joy about exactly that topic, and then I can think deeper about what makes them excited and sort of be like a little bit of a vampire and siphon off their energy and their interest and then direct direct it to the reading. Another thing you can do to deal with not understanding is to use something that is often popularly called the Feynman technique. And the Feynman technique is, describing to yourself how you would explain it as if you were a child or whatnot. So this kind of assumes that you understand a little bit. And typically I find when I used to be a professor and I used to do a bit of tutoring and so forth with students, I would find that they understand things better than they think they do. They've just sort of talked themselves out of understanding because it's almost like, well, it couldn't be that simple. But the reality is that a lot of ideas are that simple, and our brains want, novelty, they want uniqueness, they want this big explosion of aha. But that's not always what topics are about. Sometimes they really are as simple as they seem, and you do understand them better than you think, and they're not nearly as complicated. But we crave for some sort of super complexity, and we almost talk ourselves out of the understanding we have. So a way to use the Feynman technique is just to simply ask a number of questions. Not only how would I explain this to myself if I were a child, but you could say, what exactly is it that I don't understand here? Try to describe what it is you don't understand. Usually what you'll find is that actually you do understand, because if you really are truly honest about what you don't understand, you're going to wind up describing a great deal of what you've retained from what you've read. And if your answer is, well, I haven't retained anything, then another modification to the Feynman technique is to just write down, why haven't I retained anything? And then you think, well, it's because I don't use Anthony's memory techniques, so I guess I better do those. That's explaining things to yourself like a child. If I were to use memory techniques and I were to retain things and go and memorize the symbols, as that's what I have to do first, well, then I probably would understand this better. Then you coach yourself to be able to use the techniques. So that's modified Feynman technique, but very, very powerful for crafting understanding. And I have to do this to myself all the time. Why don't I get this? What is it that is evading me? And then it's like, well, maybe you better go and take a course, read a book. Maybe you have to read 5 books or whatever. And I coach myself just by writing down the question, why don't I understand this? And then I answer myself. I usually use the word maybe. Maybe it's because you don't have enough background knowledge. Answer, go get the background knowledge. Use memory palaces so that you can rapidly absorb the background knowledge, then go read the book. This makes it so much more exciting because you've now enabled yourself with the most likely path. And don't be afraid of confronting yourself with the obvious answer. We are all like little children at some level in our minds. And sometimes you got to say, listen, kid, this is the adult world. Pull up your pants and stop being a moany, whiny little cretin. Get going with the way that it works in the world. And there's nothing wrong with doing that to yourself. You might need to explore different voices, different styles and so forth. You don't want to beat yourself up necessarily, but there's a place and a space for, here's the reality, boy. Here's the brass tacks, get off the pot, as my dad used to say. Oh, it's a boring little textbook, is it? Well, here's the world's smallest violin crying just for you. I mean, that's my attitude, my style. You would have to explore your own. But there are some trends in therapy and so forth that show that this kind of identification of different parts of your mind and giving them labels and allowing them to play their roles has been helpful for some people. And it's certainly been helpful for me to do that to myself. And, I do have a stuffed cat in this room, so my inner child is never far away. I also find it useful to break things down, to not tackle entire books all at once. Rather than thinking about, okay, I have to read this massive book, I think, I'm going to read 10 pages of this book. Now, I might well read 20, 30, 50 pages at a time in a book, but I don't have that in my mind. That can lead to the suffering you're trying to escape. So rather than think about, oh, this book is so big and it's going to take forever and all this blah, blah, blah mind chatter, just focus on the page, focus on the paragraph. And the next thing you know, you'll probably have read a lot more than you expected you were going to read in an individual setting. And it's very, very fun, very powerful to just start to focus on less. Less is more. Now, there's a lot more to say, and if you want to learn more about the Memory Palace, of course, get the free course at magneticmemorymethod.com, but also you can watch a video here on YouTube where I talk about an extraction method that enables you to get a lot more out of your reading with this less is more principle. And the only thing that I would suggest is just try it without thinking about it too much, without judging it, because a lot of people have commented, oh, this will never work because you're doing a less is more principle. But the reality is I teach it that way because if you can't memorize 3 things from a book using memory palaces, how are you going to memorize 300? So that video is very, very key. And I would just suggest that when you're tackling a book, allow yourself to focus on the big details. Now here's a tip for you on finding the big details. And this is going to be a bit zen, but I want you to go with it. I want you to deeply consider this. The main points of a book, when you're trying to figure out what they are, that's the test. That is what you're being tested on. The teachers don't necessarily know. Now, they might have an answer log, and it may be that if you don't have the answers that are on the answer log, then you're not going to get the point. But in many situations, the test is for you to figure that out. Along these lines, I'll never forget a 4th year romantic literature course that I was in. I prepared like crazy for the final exam, but I didn't have time to read Cain by Lord Byron. And I was just really, really frustrated, and I thought, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? So I cooked up a strategy at the last minute, and while I'm sitting there for the exam, I scratched out the question about Lord Byron's Cain, and then I put in there, talk about the difference between attitudes to romantic poetry between Wordsworth and Coleridge. And then I just wrote out all the stuff that I knew there. Now, that was not the correct answer, but I still got an A on the exam, and I got an A in the course overall, and it was because I decided the terms. I decided what the main points were, and I decided that they weren't in Cain after all, even though that question was on the page. And this wasn't the first time that I had done this. I haven't taken a multiple choice exam since I was in my undergrad, at least not a serious one, that, you know, the stakes were high. But I've done that, and I've just scratched out the question. I said, please turn over. And I had written on the back, this question is not well worded, there is no correct answer. Here's what I think instead. And I got through. I passed. I wound up getting a PhD in the end. And a lot of people don't realize that the world is a little bit more malleable than you think. But the test is that you know what the main point is because you've read the book and you've decided what's important in the book. And then you can substantiate your claim that that's the most important point or that's a key idea with evidence, ideally from the book. And often, authors are telling you what they think are the main points, but that doesn't mean that they are. This is part of what mastery of knowledge is all about. You being able to perceive those granular details and say, well, it might be the case that in Art of Memory, Frances Yates says this is the key thing. But actually, if you look on page 45, she talks about ars rotunda or whatever, and you go, that's the key thing that people are missing. If only there was more attention to that. And then you explain why. Well, because the opposite is ars quadrata, the square art of memory. We need ars rotunda because it's round, it's vibrant, it has all those wonderful magnetic modes that are taught at magneticmemorymethod.com. So I seize upon ars rotunda, I make a big deal out of it, and I substantiate it. I explain why. This is ultimately what your teachers want. This is ultimately what your future employers want. It's what your employers want right now, is for you to take charge, take command, point out what exactly is important here, and what am I missing, so that we can improve the bottom line, or so that we can give you the A+, or what have you. And if you're just able to explain why something is important and then demonstrate why, then it doesn't matter if you have exactly the answer they're looking for. You just need the answer that you can substantiate with evidence. And of course, if there are key points on a little answer roster and you have to have every single one exactly the way it is, one way you can make the reading much more exciting is to do a little bit of spying and try to find out if you can get previous exams, examples of the exams from previous years, and there's lots of material like that out there available. I used to go to the secretary's office of the department. Let's say it was the Department of Science, and I would say, where is last year's exam for the course that I'm taking? And then there would be a big folder and pull it out, and then there would be last year's exams going back 10 years. And I would just glance through that, study it, and go, okay, this is what needs to be memorized, and then memorize that. The only thing I wish is that we had these cameras like we have these days on our cell phones. Back then it was Nokia, and at the very best you'd have a highly pixelated little image that you'd be able to take from this camera, but I don't remember ever having a Nokia that had a camera in it. But these days people can go and look at the previous exams and snap up all those extra pages and carry them in their pockets. Now don't cheat, Just use the memory palace to help you in your reading. It makes it so much more engaging. You know what the questions are. You memorize the questions in one memory palace. You memorize the answers in another memory palace. Then you go and you sit for that exam, and you know you got to check all those boxes. Bang, 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 bang. So if you want more ideas on how to extract information from the books that you're reading, make it much more engaging, and you're willing to follow a less is more principle, at least in the beginning, so that you can reliably remember 3 things per chapter, so that you might remember 30 or 300 in the future, go and watch my video on how to memorize a textbook next. So Cheshire, what do you think? You feeling better about your ability to be engaged on each and every page of the books that you read? What are you talking about, moron? I'm a stuffed cat.